Net zero is already in retreat, or at least the 2030 net zero for electricity target is very unlikely now to be achieved. We've had retreats on EVs, gas boilers, the airports are being expanded, DRAX has been given another subsidy, and then there's the budget cuts to Great British Energy, one of those quangos, and to a host of other aspects of climate change policy. And behind all that lies the Comprehensive Spending Review, which is upcoming, and you can expect more cuts to DESNZ and all those organisations involved in the net zero campaign. And thinking back to the budget last autumn, the cost of capital has gone up a lot for the capital-intensive renewables that are promised, the 30 to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, the solar, the onshore wind, the nuclear and so on. And you can see that adding all this together, things don't look good on the promises from the manifesto of the government about what's going to happen by 2030, 58 months' time. But all of that comes before we get to the really big challenge to net zero, and that's defence. Defence is probably the most carbon-intensive industry you can think of. Think submarines, think missiles, think tanks, think all the infrastructure that goes with a modern army. Think of buildings, think of houses, think of all the stuff that we get used to from a military perspective. And if we look through an expansion of military spending in the UK, maybe to 3% of GDP, let's remember that behind that expansion of the military share of GDP lies the question of, well, what sort of military do you want? I mean, at the moment, we have a military budget which is significantly taken up with building and maintaining 4 submarines, Trident nuclear weapons, and, oh yes, pensions for retired military people. So we don't really start with a kind of 2% GDP or 2.25% GDP standing army as you might imagine. We start with a much lower baseline if we're really serious about defending this country. And when you look at defence and its carbon intensity, and you ask yourself, well, since it's going to be even more of a contribution to our carbon emissions, couldn't we just decarbonise defence? Like we're going to decarbonise agriculture, decarbonise transport and so on. After all, that's what we're going to have to do if we're going to meet the Climate Change Act overall requirements. And of course, the Climate Change Committee is pretty much silent on defence, but it ought not to be given its statutory remit. So just think about a decarbonised defence industry. We'd have tanks run on batteries, and they'd have to stop for recharging points, presumably on the battlefield or in remote locations. We would have a real concern about the exposure of offshore wind, of interconnectors, of all the things that are supposed to make sure that we have firm power. The defence side needs definitely firm power. No good waiting for the sun to shine or the wind to blow, or taking the risk that on battle day, neither of those two things are happening, that it's the middle of February and it's a high pressure, cold, dark, high demand winter period. Defence is going to need steel. No good closing blast furnaces for primary steel and replacing them with recycled steel using electricity for use, for example, in the building industry. No, we want the highest grade steel, and that to date is made in a very carbon intensive way. We're definitely going to need security of oil and gas supplies. If defence is essentially a internal combustion engine activity, jet engine activity, etc., then we're going to have the same sorts of problems that Rommel had in North Africa. You can't run out of the fuel. You have to have stockpiles. You have to have your own sources if possible. You have to have multiple ways of accessing this energy. So not very compatible with defence to close down production in the North Sea to just stop oil, as we're exhorted, on the grounds that we have to get out of fossil fuels and therefore we have to stop producing it. We'd have to import even more, and indeed that's the current policy at the moment. And in the gas case, it's gas from pipelines from Norway and LNG, which, put it in brackets, but is much more polluting than pipeline gas. So substituting North Sea gas production for LNG is hardly a climate-friendly activity. And then we look more generally across to North Sea and our overall exposure in our net zero world. The NESO report about what would be necessary to meet that 2030 target had in mind something like 8 to 12 gigawatts of what I call voluntary power cuts, active demand management, no good for defence there, and it had 10 gigawatts or so of interconnectors relying on Europeans to supply the electricity when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Well, in both cases, not only is this non-firm power that's at stake, but also you have to ask yourself, is the energy really going to flow through those electricity cables if we turned out to be in a wartime situation? Probably not. And any defence planning has to take into account what might happen to the UK if, for example, the Baltics and into Northern Europe come under pressure from Russia. Before we get to that stage, and still with the net zero stuff in the North Sea and all those gas pipelines, etc., you have to ask yourself a pretty simple question. If you were sitting in the MOD and you were planning how to defend Britain, that's what you should do there. You should spend every day thinking through how would we withstand an attack. You'd start with thinking through, well, what sort of attacks might we face? And we've learned a lot from Ukraine, and we've learned a lot from what's been going on since Russia started to get sanctioned. And it's pretty clear that target number one will be energy and communications infrastructure. That's what Putin did in attacking Ukraine and continues to do so, and that's what we could expect to happen here. We've had the, inverted commas, punishment of Finland and Sweden for having the audacity to join NATO by cutting their cables. Mainly communications, but also energy has come to the fore. And in the Ukraine war, the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines from Russia to Germany tell you everything about the ease with which these pipelines can be attacked. They're incredibly vulnerable. Now think forward to modern warfare technology. You'd send swarms of drones, and what you need for a swarm of drones is lots and lots of targets, which are each probably not worth defending. So if you wanted to attack Britain's energy infrastructure, why not think about a swarm of drones and all those individual wind turbines sitting offshore? They're very vulnerable, and each contributes very little power in themselves, and so protecting each one of them would be really expensive, just as protecting all those cables connecting the UK to Europe in order to ensure our security of supply is pretty expensive too. The truth is, they're pretty easy to cut, the cables. The wind farms are very, very vulnerable offshore. And if we're going to do defence properly, we need an energy defence strategy. And that means a defence strategy for all the stuff that we're putting offshore and all the cables, etc., which rely on foreign supplies to the UK. Who's going to pay for all of this? It's going to be quite a big chunk of a defence budget, I suggest. And if that's the case, then we should reassess the costs of our energy to include the defence costs of our energy, which have been largely ignored. Should the wind farm developer offshore pay for its defence? Should those with the interconnectors have a charge, an infrastructure charge, a use of system charge for funds provided to the MOD to provide what? A series of submarines and naval vessels? More scrutiny? Drone defence systems? All of this is part and parcel of trying to think through defence into the future. And so what one observes is that there is a very big tension between defence and the net zero energy strategy that we've been pursuing. If we really mean defence, it means reindustrialisation. It means building the supply chains. Yes, it means building energy-intensive industries to make stuff again. And of course, this wouldn't look very good for a country which has relied upon deindustrialisation to reduce its emissions so it can be the poster child of decarbonisation globally. We've had the luxury of escaping a proper measure of our carbon footprint by concentrating on territorial carbon emissions and then deindustrialising, and so down those goes. The reverse could be very painful. Then there's the question of money. This is incredibly expensive to do a reversal of the peace dividend that we've had since 1990. And the comprehensive spending review coming up has to make room for this. It's an easy political win to cut foreign aid and claim that that's going to pay for defence. It isn't. It's only a drop in the ocean. And remember, quite a lot of that aid is spent on asylum seekers in the UK, and there's no evidence that that number is going down or becoming less costly. So we're going to have to think again on this front. And I suggest that the consequences of all of this is that the net zero programme and the policies that we're putting in place will need to be reconsidered in three ways. First of all, the cost of net zero, including its defence of its infrastructure, is going to be higher. Secondly, we have to think about where we're going to get our oil and gas to power those tanks and those fighter aircraft and run a modern army. And thirdly, on top of all that lot, we've got to think about the firm power requirements of our systems going forward. And put this together, what we really need to do is revisit the target. Why are we hell-bent on achieving net zero electricity in what now 58 months? Why exactly are we pursuing a territorial carbon production target when it doesn't measure our carbon footprint? Only carbon consumption does that. And then finally, we have to really get real about dealing with climate change in what is a new world compared with the period since 1990 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, but actually a return to normalcy. The world before 1990 looked very like this too. After all, in the 1980s, we were spending about the same on defence as the National Health Service. That's no longer true. Imagine if we had to do that now. That would be a completely different world. So there is a real tension between defence and net zero. The retreat from net zero continues, and it's going to accelerate if we go down the defence route. Less money, more emissions, more serious priorities in the short term for this government, and hence it's even less likely we'll achieve that target. Better to set a realistic target and spend money wisely in achieving it than hopelessly have a sprint to try and achieve what is now an increasingly impossible target with all the overlaps, problems, uncoordination, etc. that will result. Thank you.